Hey, it's Suze. Good to see you guys. Kinda. I guess you're seeing me. I'm not really seeing you. But this is the new world of education, is this sort of on-demand process. So I'm going to try to make this super efficient because I know you're all really busy. But I think this is a really, really cool tool for your negotiations as the market changes. If you remember when we did your CNE buyers course and your CNE sellers course, if you took them during the peak of the sellers market, I had stripped out the ZOPA section of that course because it really wasn't of any value in those crazy negotiations where it was really bidding up over the price. The ZOPA worksheet just didn't work for that. And there was so much other cool stuff that we needed to be talking about during that crazy market. So I sort of had put more emphasis on the things that would matter to you. But now the market's starting to balance out a bit. Still fairly strong sellers market in most of Canada. But relative to what it was, definitely, a whole different game. So you're still having multiple offers. I know that, and the ZOPA tool will not be as much value to you. But in those negotiations where you're not in multiple offers, and the buyer and seller are negotiating between the asking price and an initial offering price, the ZOPA tool can be super, super valuable. So this tool is not unique to real estate. It's definitely used in corporate negotiations, any negotiations that have numbers involved. ZOPA is very common. It's an acronym for Zone of Possible Agreement. Pretty straightforward. So what is this? So there's first of all, a few concepts that I want to kind of get across to you. We did this briefly. We covered off reservation point and aspiration point in the courses that you took because I thought that they were quite valuable even outside of the ZOPA model. The reservation point is a point at which you are indifferent between a deal and no deal. So in some ways, it's a buyer's maximum, right? There's a price at which the buyer doesn't want to buy the house. So they have a maximum price. It's also the seller's minimum because there's a price at which the seller does not want to sell the house. And so they have a minimum. But the reservation points gives it some nuances beyond just minimum and maximum. And another term that we had introduced briefly was aspiration point. And an aspiration point is kind of like a goal, but again, more nuanced and ambitious, but not outrageous goal. And what it is it can set a goal without your client getting too attached to that goal. Because there may be other things in an offer that are exceptionally good, but the number's not quite within their goal, and yet it's really a good idea for them to take their offer. And so by calling it an aspiration point, you give them a little bit more wiggle room to not be as attached to a certain number. So a couple of definitions there. Another concept that comes up in a strong way for ZOPA is this midpoint psychology. People are very biased towards going to the midpoint between two numbers. Doesn't mean that's where it will necessarily fall, but it is a calculation that people, many people do, and it influences the psychology about what they might take. And so a quote from the guys at Harvard, be aware of the midpoint rule. The best predictor of the final deal price is the midpoint of the first semi-reasonable offer and counteroffer. And if you remember about reasonable, it was the anchoring term that we talked about in those courses. And anchors are strong psychological attachments to certain numbers. And so when you have a semi-reasonable offer or a semi-reasonable counteroffer, those form anchors. And we can predict that the midpoint will become very powerful in that negotiation. The extent to which you can achieve or even surpass the midpoint rule will depend on how effectively you have diffused the anchor. And I think some of you will really get the importance of that and how important it is not to allow the other side to get really stuck on an anchor price that's disadvantageous to you. Anyway, I just put the name of Chris's book up here. Chris Voss, you guys probably all know him. He teaches the master class on negotiation, and he's a wonderful speaker. And he's awesome. And he wrote a book called Never Split the Difference. It's worth reading. The one thing about Chris Voss is they have to recognize is that in his negotiations, he was a hostage negotiator. He was adversarial with the other party, right? The other party was a criminal who wanted to kill people, and he was negotiating with that. That's not the case in real estate. We really want to work hard to build a legitimate collaboration with the other agent so we can increase the odds of getting a successful transaction for both clients and really looking for the win-win. So just understand a fundamental. I'm not saying you shouldn't think Chris is great, because he is. And he knows a lot, and his teaching style is very fun. I think it's worth knowing. Okay, so what the heck is this ZOPA? Generally, we take the seller's minimum price or reserve price, reservation price, and we take the buyer's maximum price or reservation price, and the gap between them is called the zone of possible agreement. If that's positive, we're in great shape, and we're probably going to get a deal done. But we would like to get the deal done in closer to our end of the zone of possible agreement so that our client gets a benefit. Oftentimes there's no ZOPA when the seller's minimum or reservation price is higher than the buyer's maximum or reservation price. And I often get people going, oh, I don't know what I did wrong in that negotiation. And, when we unpack it, they didn't do anything wrong. There was no ZOPA. And there's no ZOPA, there's no deal. And that's okay. Go find a different house for your buyer. Go find a different buyer for your seller. A couple of quick examples here. I want you to kind of do this as a worksheet on your the form that you printed, the download. Put a mark on it, says the seller's minimum price or reserve price. Put a tick on the line at 540, and then the buyer has a maximum price or reserve price of 600,000. What is the ZOPA? Now, lots of you guys can do this in your head, I know, but I'd like you to do it on the worksheet so that you can start working out how you're going to use the worksheet. Right, so here's it goes. You go buyer max 600,000, seller min 540, ZOPA $60,000, massive ZOPA, 10% ZOPA. You'd have to be a really bad negotiator not to get a deal done here. Another example: the seller has a minimum price or reserve price of 1.4, buyer has a max price of 1.25. What's the ZOPA? You got it, right? No ZOPA. The seller's minimum is $150,000 higher than the buyer's maximum. There's no deal here. Now, of course, you say, are our numbers accurate? Do we have an accurate estimate of buyer max and seller minimum? That's sometimes you have an accurate estimate and sometimes you don't. And so that's, going to factor into this equation as well. One more example: the seller has a minimum price or reserve price of $950, and the buyer has a maximum price or reserve price of $960. What is the ZOPA? You guys got it, $10,000. So pretty small ZOPA, down around 1%. Going to be a lot harder to find that range in this particular transaction with such a small ZOPA. Okay, so that sort of gives you an idea. This is the worksheet. You downloaded one. I'm going to show you how to use that worksheet. Just before we do that, I want to introduce one more concept about buyer's initial offers, which is fairly important, is this idea of both chill effect and buyer's remorse. So chill effect is if the buyer comes in too low. Many times the seller is very attached or has a personal identity or an emotional attachment to the house. And so a low offer feels like a personal insult to them, and they get really cold to the buyer. And now, even if the buyer was to come up to something that was more reasonable and closer to market value, the seller already has this sort of negative take on them, and it can be enough to scuffle the deal. So you want to be able to recognize that a really, really low offer could have a negative impact on being able to get your buyer the house. And buyer's remorse is another concept, and we certainly saw buyer's remorse in the very, very strong seller's market. Blind bidding causes that in some ways because they don't know what the next best offer was. They don't know if they overpaid. There's a lot of sleepless nights after buyers are successful buying a house, and so it's kind of difficult. So we want to sort of deal with that up front. Let them know that they might feel some remorse, right? And that they really need to own this number and be okay with this number because of the potential for buyer's remorse. But you're also going to see buyer's remorse in a more negotiated pricing, where they're negotiating between the offering price and the first offer from the buyer. And, that's something that you really want to consider as you go through this process. Working with your buyer on a ZOPA worksheet can really go a long way to eliminating the opportunity for either chill effect or buyer's remorse. All right, so let's go back to the ZOPA worksheet. At the very top is the place where you're going to fill in the numbers: buyer max, average sale price. You might want to write these in because you might not remember exactly what these are. So buyer max, average sale price, buyer goal, buyer BATNA. On the other side is the seller's list price, the average sale price. It's a percentage of list price that properties are selling for in the current market conditions. Seller goal, seller minimum, and seller BATNA. We've got the middle areas where you're going to do the calculations, do the little tick marks, and do the actual mathematical modeling. And the bottom part is just an area to remind us that it's not only money, that there are other significant things that are going to influence the negotiation. And so some of them are written in here as a reminder that we are not just negotiating over the price of the property. There are other value elements and other considerations that we have to take into account. Okay, so let's put some numbers in and let's see how this little baby works. So these numbers just out of the blue, just put them together. I made it quite a large spread, so it'll be easier to see. Likely in the market that you're working in right now, you wouldn't have quite as large a spread as this, because we are still in a fairly healthy seller's market, just not as crazy as it was. But I wanted to give us numbers that were fairly spread out so we could see how the model works. So the buyer's maximum is $965,000. The seller's list price is $980,000. And the seller's minimum is $920,000. So somehow we've gathered that all together, or we've made estimates that that's the case. And so we're going to put that into the worksheet area. We put the buyer max at $965,000. We put the seller's min at $920,000. And we have a ZOPA of $45,000. Obviously, the seller wants in the higher end of that, and the buyer wants in the lower end of that. And this is where you get to shine as an agent by using the ZOPA worksheet to help your client get the best outcome for them. All right, so we've got the seller's list price at $980,000. What should the buyer's opening offer be? Now, you guys are all going to say a number that's too high here because you've been in such a strong seller's market for so long, and that's okay, right? And I think you're still in a seller's market, and so you're going to come up with a higher number. But the rule of thumb is that it should be just outside of ZOPA and still reasonable. So obviously we want to stay in the 900s, but if we were to get ourselves outside of ZOPA, we're going to have to be just at the 900 mark, or else we're not going to have a midpoint that's going to be very advantageous. And so what's the midpoint between the offering price and the asking price? What's the midpoint there? Give you guys just a moment. And coincidentally, it's $940,000. It's roughly in the middle of the ZOPA. And so if you're the listing agent and you get an offer that you think is very low, you should be asking yourself, what's the midpoint? And does the midpoint fall in the ZOPA range? And if it does, you should probably be negotiating in good faith with that buyer and that buyer's agent, because you're going to get a deal done, which is kind of what you're getting paid to do. It's what the seller wants you to do, is to get a deal done. And so that's the midpoint. So that's kind of interesting. All right, now let's talk about counteroffers. So if the seller is to counteroffer at $970,000, it moves the midpoint to $935,000. If the seller was to counter at $960,000, it moves the midpoint to $930,000. And if the seller was to counter at $950,000, it moves the midpoint to $925,000. So you can see, as a buyer's agent, you want to work very hard to get the listing agent and the seller to sign back as low as possible. The lower they sign back, the more advantageous the midpoint comes to you. As a listing agent, you want to be very cognizant that signing back at low numbers shifts the midpoint to a place that's disadvantageous to you, and you want to be very careful with your sign backs. You don't want to lose the buyer, but at the same point, you want to be getting that buyer to be making offers that come up. So let's go back to the first sign back. So the seller counter offers at $970, and we have a midpoint of $935. But then if the buyer counter offers at $910, it moves the midpoint back to $940. If we're able to get the buyer to counteroffer at $920, it moves the midpoint to $945. So I think you guys get the idea. What you're trying to understand is the price that you sign back at, whether you're the seller representing the seller or representing the buyer, creates a new midpoint that has some psychology attached to it. And you want to be able to control what that midpoint is so that you have the best chance of getting in the most favorable part of ZOPA for your client. And sharing this with your client can be really, really advantageous for them and for their thinking and for their understanding of your skills in negotiation. So yeah, ZOPA, a mathematical modeling tool to help you use the psychological bias of the midpoint rule to benefit your negotiations. I hope this has been valuable to you. I know some of you will grab this tool and use it like crazy, and some not so much. But it's a tool for you guys. Keep on learning. Stay in touch if you haven't finished your MCNE. Let's get your courses going. If you finished your MCNE, I'll have some new material for you soon. Stay in touch. Keep reading my blog. Keep letting me know what you need. And I'll see you all really soon.